Hello, dear friends. We're sincerely glad to welcome you again. And today we're going to talk to the esteemed Igor Mikhailovich Danilov.
Greetings.
Igor Mikhailovich, there was quite a memorable point in the previous conversation, which was really striking and notable when you said that our entire life consists of the moments here and now as links of a single chain. And in every here and now, it is extremely important to stay in God's love and not to break this chain, because it is this very chain that restrains the demon, restrains the devil who is inside us, who manipulates a human as personality and distorts personality's true aspirations. Our special thanks to you, of course, for telling us about Bodhidharma, because since you first told us about the legendary Bodhidharma competitions, we often received questions from people. What is the true meaning? What is the real purpose of those competitions? What was it all for? Why was it all introduced and given? We are very grateful to you, and it is so valuable that we have learned not only about the true meaning of those competitions, but also about the very teaching of Bodhidharma and about the two paths thanks to which a great many people actually succeeded to save themselves and to gain life eternal within a short period of time. Of course, it's a pity that knowledge is being lost. In this case, too, a lot of records were burned and a great deal of information was distorted, up to the point that nowadays people even argue and ask questions. Did Bodhidharma exist in reality, or is it actually such a folklore character and all the stories about him are legends?
I cannot say that all the stories about him are true, but as for whether he really existed, of course he did, just like Jesus Christ. However, nowadays, many people also argue whether there was Jesus Christ. Similarly, there is a lot of debate regarding Bodhidharma, whether he was here, what year he died, etc. As well as regarding his teaching. After all, as of today, that very Chan Buddhism, which Bodhidharma actually introduced, is greatly divided. I would say it is far from the teaching that he brought here. Well, if our friends allow me, I will answer this question in an associative way. I mean regarding his teaching. Bodhidharma brought here pure Buddhism, the same one Gautama had given. The only difference, as we said, was that Bodhidharma described two paths instead of three. I would make an associative comparison. Say, Bodhidharma brought two chihuahuas here and said, "People, take care of this breed, keep it pure." But people are people. They slacked off. Others were interested. What if we crossbreed Chihuahua with this dog or that dog? Someone didn't take care of those Chihuahuas at all, so they were running around freely, and today, instead of pedigree Chihuahuas, we have, for instance, a Central Asian Shepherd and a Bull Terrier. The only thing that connects them with Chihuahuas is that they are dogs.
I see.
Well, something like that. Why did such a wave start against Bodhidharma? We can answer in a simple way too. Even back in those days, during his lifetime, his teaching became a stumbling block for mainstream Buddhism. In no way did his teaching fit into the main framework of that very Buddhism. It was strikingly different. It differed by the fact that the teaching which Bodhidharma brought here gave people an opportunity to attain enlightenment, true awakening, even to become a bodhisattva during their lifetime, instead of driving them into illusion. This is true. Moreover, his teaching gave both an easy path for lay people who could gain life and a path that enabled a person to become a bodhisattva during his lifetime, that is to achieve a very serious and, I would say, significant success during his lifetime. This is serious. Meanwhile, mainstream Buddhism had long gone into mysticism and simplicity of understanding. All the meaning that Gautama had given was actually removed from it, and only an easy path was left. Everything switched to the state of peace, which a person should attain after death, even by falling into mysticism, which is creation of a glade or creation of an active subpersonality. This is really so. That's where numerous debates arose from, up to the point that they began to erase Bodhidharma, whether he existed at all. To be honest, I don't understand how there can be debates about Bodhidharma if records have been preserved to this day regarding what he spoke about personally. Moreover, the records were made by those people whom he talked to. This is indeed so, and these records Yes, they have been restored because the originals burned down along with the Shaolin monastery. We already discussed this, but nevertheless they've been preserved. Besides the records, the differences between Chan Buddhism and mainstream Buddhism have also been preserved. Well, of course, it's all already like with Chihuahuas, nonetheless the differences do exist. In general, it has to be understood that the entire spiritual path which a person discovers through Buddhism is multifaceted, just as multifaceted as Buddhism itself. I would say that present-day Buddhism is sort of the most mystical religious cult, if it may be called this way at all. Why? Because, yes, a part of Buddhism may be attributed to religion, while another part, excuse me, is already far from being a religion. These are practical, I would say fundamental, well-developed methods of how a person can achieve certain states or capabilities that he aspires to. This is really so. Let's take the mystical side of Buddhism. It would seem, well again, the mystical side. But what is mysticism, friends? Let's approach this side honestly. Many people will say, mysticism is something that we do not perceive. We do not perceive it because we don't know how. But there are people who do perceive it. This is indeed true.
Right.
Let's start with simple things. For example, in mainstream Buddhism, there are branches where the attainment of peace is practiced. In other words, by means of special practices and control of his thoughts and emotions, while still being alive, a person forms a state in himself that can be equated with a sleeping subpersonality. That is, he deliberately prepares himself for the fact that as soon as his physical body dies, he will enter a special state of peace, deep peace. Tell me, does it make any sense to live a whole life and work very hard so as to later go to sleep? Yes, this is wonderful, I agree, it's a reward for anyone who is unable to gain life. But if within the same period of time and with the same efforts you can achieve a state of enlightenment or even become a bodhisattva, then how can you exchange what is alive for what is inevitably dead? That's illogical, but it all boils down to that. You know, it is being done as if on purpose. There is also another side. There are trends in Buddhism, as you and I already discussed, where they form sort of a glade, when a person, again with the help of certain practices which he regularly performs, first creates in himself an image and then shapes it into reality. It's a reality for a future subpersonality, such a glade where he feels good, where there is soft grass and a beautiful flower and he stays there, shutting himself off from the entire world. In other words, when a person becomes a subpersonality after the death of his physical body, he will find himself in this glade. This is really so. Why? Because he has created it, he has bought it from the system with all his life force and all his time, such a small fragment for himself, for the future where he will experience peace, bliss and tranquility, and he will do nothing. That is, he will be completely cut off from the world, but his consciousness will not torture him. There is such a thing too, but there is also something else. For example, an active subpersonality. When a person consciously shapes his rebirth, and this is really true, that is, he prepares, gains a lot of power and creates conditions under which, having additional powers, when he enters a new body, he seizes control over it. This is also true, it's a controlled rebirth. Many people will say, well, that's just complete mysticism.
Yes, exactly.
But what about the Dalai Lama? After all, every time he reincarnates, he suppresses a personality as an active subpersonality that has plenty of power. And why does he have plenty of power? Because a lot of people, millions around the world, share their vital force or rail with him through their attention. And he has more than enough power after death to capture, or rather to take someone else's life and to exist himself. Then gradually, as he grows up, he completely pushes out or puts to sleep the dominant personality, the one that was born, sending it to the state of subpersonality, and he himself becomes a dominant subpersonality. In other words, he lives his existence to the fullest. He realizes who he is. He recalls everything about himself and remembers everything, his personal items and much more. It's a fact, it's the truth, and it is confirmed. How can it be explained? Again, what is mysticism? From a scientific point of view, after all, our science does not tolerate mysticism, right? If something is beyond their knowledge, they immediately say, well, it is mysticism. It's not even worth studying.
It is unscientific.
It is unscientific. Yet, I will say it like this, every scientist, true scientist, is obliged to study everything that can lead to a result. And every true scientist always goes beyond, into the unknown, in order to understand it. But if a person who calls himself a scientist confines himself just to generally visible and confirmed facts, then he's not a scientist, he's either a statistician or an accountant who only carries out the process of observation and calculation. Well, that's true in fact. I mean, he doesn't think, doesn't inquire, and doesn't search for what lies beyond the cognition of other people. Can he bring any innovation, knowledge, or anything else into this world? Of course he cannot. A simple example, we have smartphones nowadays, we use them, we connect via the internet, we watch movies on them. Just imagine if 300 or 400 years ago you would show this smartphone to someone, especially to clergymen, that people are walking around in it, what would they say? The first thing they would say is that it is magic, and that people's souls are trapped there. What would happen to you? Would you get a standing ovation for your discovery? Look, here's a smartphone, okay? Or would you be burnt at the stake? So friends, that's the answer to what mysticism, magic, or whatever you want to call it really is. Again, regarding science, in general, mysticism, not mysticism, whatever, let's go back to the year 1899. The head of the United States Patent Office made a statement that the patent office should be closed. Why? Because he said that everything that could be invented had already been invented by that time. That's our scientific community, friends. I'm not saying that everyone is like that, no, because a lot of interesting things have been invented since then. But they've been invented by those who had the courage to look into mysticism, instead of being satisfied only with accounting. That's the answer as to who are scientists and who are statisticians. Based on that, I will say the following: a real scientist will never ignore facts, no matter how mystical they may seem. Any mysticism, for us today, is tomorrow's physics. It's a natural and simple process, just like today's smartphone, laptop, internet, and many other things, say space travel. All of this is actually simple for us. Yet not so long ago, for our great-grandparents, it was mysticism. So, as you see, mysticism and science are basically the same thing. To put it simply, all mysticism is science that is unknown to us yet. It is physics, because all the fundamentals of all mysticism go back to physics, the physics of the process. And the more we uncover that mysticism, the more we can achieve in this world. After all, this is true. That's why the Ahnenerbe was financed by intelligent people. That's why a lot of discoveries have been made by people, and God willing, if we are not stupid, in the future we will discover much more than we've discovered thus far. If we as humanity have enough intelligence and aspiration, first of all, to live. Let's take something based on Buddhism. A sensible person definitely would not regard it as science. This can certainly be classified as magic, and kind of downright magic at that. A simple example: controlled rebirth. Is it possible? Well, we've just mentioned that. The Dalai Lama has been practicing it for more than one generation of those lamas. Yet, on the other hand, in its time, the Ahnenerbe began to study this process. This is actually a process that was used in Buddhism a long time ago. And then the Ahnenerbe began to study it for a specific purpose. I think we are going to talk about this now. Now, let's imagine, well, many will say the Ahnenerbe is a mystical order and things like that. Yes, it was Nazi Germany, but the key word here is Germany, which means Germans. While Germans are characterized by their pragmatism, rationality, and thoughtfulness, they are extremely smart people, and this is really true. Let's look at the following fact at least, namely how many Nobel Prize winners came from Germany, how many colossal, world-scale works in music, science, literature, and many other fields, as well as how many useful and necessary things Germany, I mean the Germans, have given to our entire humanity. To say that at that time they were mystical or stupid, well, it's an insult. They were the most intelligent people at that time. It is true. And imagine, Germany is preparing for the war, but at the same time, it is funding such an institute as the Ahnenerbe, and it spends funds.
Generously.
Yes, it spends a lot on it. The Ahnenerbe seems to be sort of a mystical institute. It is basically a stupid action, right? But is it stupid? And what do we see? At the end of the year 1939, the Ahnenerbe began to carry out experiments on controlled rebirth. These facts really exist, because archives have been preserved, and the facts are very obvious and real. What was taking place? I mean, a person who was trained according to the system of Buddhism, a certain school of it, was ready to live his life consciously. He didn't destroy his body physically, but left it on command. That is, a person who controls the functions of his body and his consciousness to such an extent that he can switch off his life in a controlled way and transition. A so-called vessel is prepared for him. That is, at the time when a woman gives birth to a child, and on the 8th day, from the moment the umbilical cord is cut, everything is calculated there very thoroughly. So this person who is not far from this new, or as they say, empty vessel, by this time, by the 8th day, he leaves his life and fills this vessel. Well, there are certain laws there, let's not delve into that because it would distract our friends and lead them away in the wrong direction. But in fact, in 1943 and 1944, the Nazis clearly understood and knew that this process was absolutely real. And within a short period of time, these methods of controlled rebirth were mastered by those who belonged to the circle of the Nazi top leaders. That's why at the trial they were laughing when the death sentences were announced to them. It seems to be mysticism. Those people were sort of psychologically attuned to transition and so forth. But I have a simple question. If we look why by the 1970s and during the 70s did those anonymous numbered accounts start to be used by someone, precisely those accounts opened by the Nazis in their time. Nobody used them after the war before that time. These are the bank deposits opened precisely by the top brass of the Reich. And we can see that exactly at the time when those accounts began to be used, moreover actively used, the world began to change. After all, recall, watch or read. What was the world like before 1970? What was prevailing? Before the 70s, pacifist moods reigned in this world. There was peace, aspiration for humaneness, for love and joy. Well, after the 70s, everything changed dramatically. And the most interesting thing is that precisely at that time, the theory of the golden billion appeared.
Yes, exactly.
The idea of reducing the entire human population to 1 billion, or even less, due to environmental disturbances. Moreover, exactly at that time they started saying that problems with the climate started, and they began to fight climate problems, which as of today haven't changed at all but only aggravated thanks to their efforts, in quotes of course. Today any sane person can see what is happening to the climate. A simple question if we are talking about climate. Did the Nazis know about cyclicity? The answer is they surely knew, and they openly wrote about it in the Ahnenerbe. Researched this issue very well, and they knew that the world is cyclical, including in what concerns the climate. Moreover, they were quite familiar with the works of very many authoritative Buddhists, including the work of Bodhidharma. After all, as early as in the year 535, one of his closest disciples, who, by the way, later became the second abbot in Chan Buddhism after Bodhidharma himself, described his conversation with Bodhidharma. The name of this man, however, doesn't sound decent in our language, so we won't pronounce it. Whoever wants to will find it, because especially with my pronunciation it sounds not quite decent. So, this disciple described that at one of the competitions, they were discussing with Bodhidharma the duality of this world. Interestingly enough, Bodhidharma told him that the next year, 36, meaning the year 536, Bodhidharma himself would depart. And he said, then in 1500 years, humanity would either cease to exist or it would change so much that there would be many more enlightened people than non-enlightened ones. I mean, he was again talking about duality, about the duality of this world. And it was all precisely linked to the cycle. Did they know that? They did. They knew that everything repeats every 12,000 years. You see how simple everything is? Whereas now scientists argue whether cyclicity exists or not. A lot of people even state that the climate doesn't change at all. Then what have they been fighting against over such a long period of time? If the climate doesn't change, it is also an interesting question, isn't it? It seems to me there's more mysticism in fighting environmental issues and climate by our modern scientists. There is much more mysticism there than even in Buddhism. Although again, Buddhism clearly indicated, well, and in general, starting from Gautama and ending with Bodhidharma, as well as many other enlightened people, talked about the duality of the world. Why, the world is indeed dual. Let me give you, friends, another associative example for understanding. If, for instance, a train leaves point A, it will definitely arrive at point B, because the rails are laid that way, right? What can we do on this route? We as passengers or as operators of this train, all we can do is either slow it down or speed it up. But we will definitely arrive at point B. If the train is going according to schedule, it has to be at point B at a certain time. Isn't that so? It is. The same happens to all humanity when we are controlled absolutely. In other words, when we haven't gained freedom and we haven't changed anything in our lives. But just like a flock of sheep, we are being driven by a shepherd. He comes out of the field and leads the sheep to the sheep pen. He knows at what time he will bring them there, and he can describe in advance what's going to happen in a day or two, especially if he knows which sheep he's going to slaughter or do something else to. In other words, it's a predictable process. And now let's imagine that we take this train, put it on a rubber track, and give it control. What will happen? The train can go wherever the operator wants it to go or the passengers demand that it goes. The process becomes uncontrollable and point B disappears. And then we have an opportunity to build a world in which, as Bodhidharma said, the majority of people will become enlightened. Look how good that is. In general, you know, when it comes to our life, since we are already talking in terms of associations, I would again compare it to a springboard. Imagine a high mountain from which we accelerate and jump on a springboard. If we accelerate fast enough, we can go into orbit like a satellite and stay forever in a falling state. In other words, we'll never fall on Earth, but we'll revolve in orbit forever. However, if we start to slow down, get distracted at every step or every centimeter, on the approach to this springboard, if some worries emerge in us or we need something, and we stop, get distracted, lose inertia, and fail to gain enough speed, then in the end we, at the best, limp and crawl onto this springboard ourselves, or we are rolled onto it, on a wheelchair, or paramedics carry us there. Tell me, can they throw us into orbit? No. The most they can do is to drop us like garbage into that abyss, into a state of subpersonality. And this is a fact. Yet if we do not slow down, if we see the goal and ignore the obstacles, if we really strive for God's love, no one will be able to stop us. Because it is our right, it is the freedom of choice given to us by God. Indeed, everything is very simple. Therefore, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope I have answered your question. Thank you, friends. Peace be with you, and God's love.